VaYU as a first yoga university outside India, doing really thought leadership and bringing graduate education and research and eminent speakers like Subhash Kakji. We want to make sure that you love the content that we have here, as well as any other aspirations you have about VaYU and so on and so forth. So really, again, welcome you all to this amazing session by Professor Subhash Kak. And so let me just introduce him quickly. So Professor Subhash Kak is a scientist and historian who is a Regents Professor at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, USA. He was born in Srinagar and has held visiting appointments in Britain and Australia. His research includes AI and history and philosophy of science. His work has been showcased in the popular media such as Discovery and History channels, PBS, public TV in Europe, and in several documentaries on science and art. He's the author of 30 books, of which the most recent is Eternal Bharat, Truth, Meaning, and Beauty. He's a member of the Indian Prime Minister's Science, Technology, and Innovation Advisory Council. As you can see, we have a very eminent speaker here and a dear friend and an amazing human being that I had the honor of being with him in Trinidad in 2010. Today's session is titled Hinduism in a World of AI and Collapsing Populations. And it's not generally known that the populations in many parts of the world have started to fall. For example, China is expected to lose at least 700 million people in the next 80 years, and India's population will fall as well, although not as steeply as China. So this session will address the challenges created by this decline and by AI on life and on the yoga Vedic tradition around the world. So with that, I'll hand over the floor to Professor Subhash Kakji. Thank you. Welcome to VaYU.
Thank you. Namaskar to everybody. Thank you, Prashantji, for your introduction and for giving me an opportunity to speak to the audience associated with VaYU. The idea of AI creating unprecedented problems for humanity, for jobs, is well known. It's discussed all the time. And the question of whether machines will become conscious as an end to it is also a matter of great discussion, because if machines were to actually become conscious, clearly the whole world will change, and perhaps such conscious machines will not have any use for humans. But fortunately, just a few months ago, I was able to publish a paper in the leading journal in the field, proving that machines will never become conscious, which is quite consistent with ideas in Hinduism, as in Vedanta, where, for example, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that the Atman is inside the Sharir. It's not a product of the Sharir, of the body. And that's precisely what I have discovered, that no matter what kind of a computer is designed, and therefore computers of the future will not become conscious. Although that is reassuring, but that doesn't mean that AI will not change the world, because a lot of what we do in our lives is mechanistic. It's according to scripts, and clearly machines will replace us, and they'll replace us in a manner which will be absolutely disruptive. For example, just to make one point, look at education. Right now, we have thousands or tens of thousands of brick and mortar universities all over the world, with where the attraction used to be the library, where books were stored, and people had to go to the physical campus to access the books. But that has changed. First of all, the books are all available, or potentially could be available at our fingertips. And secondly, technology can be harnessed to deliver education all over the world. So the hundreds of thousands of professors that we have now could be rendered unemployed in the future if new companies which know how to take advantage of the situation come along. So this is quite clear there. Or as another example, look at the transportation sector, and the technology is almost ready. In the United States, it's estimated that about 50 to 60% of all the jobs are related to transportation. So if we had self-driving cars and trucks, clearly in one go, 50 or 60% of the people will lose their jobs, which will create havoc in society. So this is clear. Jobs are going to go away all over the world, and they will impact, of course, everybody in all societies. But the second aspect that I want to stress in my lecture is not that well known, which is that the world or humanity is expecting a collapsing population. And as Prashantji said, it's estimated that China's population over the next 80 years will be probably 1/2 to 1/3 of what it is now. Right now, it's 1.4 billion. In 80 years, it'll be from 500 to 700 million. And how do we know it? Well, for many years now, only 9 million babies are being born per year in China. So if assuming that 9 million babies were born every year for the next 80 years, which is the lifespan, that adds up to only 700 million. So clearly, population is going to shrink in a very drastic way. In India, it's going to happen in 20 years. And the measure which tells us that population is going to collapse is something called total fertility rate. And so long as the fertility rate is 2.1 or above, the population keeps on growing up. That means that every 2 people make 2.1 babies. 2.1 because some of them may not be able to reproduce in their own time, and there could be some disparity in gender ratios at birth. So you need 2.1 TFR, total fertility rate, for population to remain stable. And if it's much higher, let's say 3 or 4, then population is increasing. Now, the fertility rate in China has gone to 1.1, which means 100 people make only 51 babies. In India, it's dropped to 2.0, but it's dropped below 2.1 only recently. So it'll be another 20 years when those who are still in the childbearing stage exit, which is from 20, they become 40 or so, that the population actually starts to go down. And which is why India's population is expected to go up a bit further from the current 1.4. It is the most populous nation in the world right now. And then in 20 years, it'll start going down. And we don't know exactly how far it'll go down, but certainly not as steeply as China's decline. Now, most alarmingly, you have countries in Europe like Italy and Spain, where the fertility rate is also about 1.1, and about 15% of all the homes in Italy and Spain are empty, and the population is declining rapidly. In all of Europe, the fertility rate is about 1.3, so it's declining there as well. And therefore, one of the important political issues right now is immigration, because these countries are trying to get replacement population from other countries in order to maintain their geopolitical strength. And this is one of the drivers of migration, both in Europe and the United States. So now, what does it do as far as Hinduism is concerned? Well, currently, if you look at our mother nation, India is about 80% Hindu. And since the total fertility rate has dropped below 2, but there is a disparity in the fertility rate of Hindus and non-Hindus. And for non-Hindus, it's higher. So the distribution from being 80-20 will probably shrink in the next 50, 60, 80 years, and maybe it'll be 70-30 or something, which is not as catastrophic as what's going to happen in many countries. In Europe, the Islamic population, for example, over the next many decades is going to, in some countries like Sweden and Germany or France, is going to cross 20 and even 30%. And therefore, there could be a lot of conflict related to, which direction those countries ought to be going, or what the nature of the culture that countries will call their own, which of course will happen only if the immigrant population assimilates. But there are certain cultures which are so certain of their way of looking at reality that they are not going to assimilate, and therefore there are going to be political and other issues which will become very endemic in many parts of the world. And possibly one consequence of that could be the emergence of authoritarian governments in order to keep peace, just as there are certain Islamic countries which are quite peaceful, like UAE, but that is because of the authoritarian government. And this whole idea of democracy as we see it probably may not last for too many decades from where we are now. So this changing ratio in the demographics is an important factor that that Hindus need to be aware of. And they also need to be aware that the Hindu diaspora outside of India also has a fertility rate which is less than 2, which means without new people joining the diaspora from India, their population will also keep on shrinking from wherever they might be at this point in time. So that, for example, in the US, if Hindus are, say, 3.5 or 4 million, if there were no further additions to this group of people, their numbers will decline. So we can see that great change is taking place with implications which are of the greatest consequence. Not so much for India, because the Hindus are in substantial numbers, from 80%, even if the fractions go down to 70%, it's not going to make all that of a difference. Although there would be certain parts of India where this majority may shrink or actually get inverted. For example, in Jammu and Kashmir, or in Punjab, or in Assam and other northeastern states. So there would be implications of that, which the politics will also have to respond to, the politics within India. So this is one side. The other side is that both AI as well as population decline, and before I lose this thread, there are two scenarios about the world population over the next 80 years by the end of the century. One is that it might go down from the current 8 billion to as little as 4 or 5 billion. And on the other hand, if the decline is not that steep, it might actually increase possibly to a maximum of 10 billion. So from the range that people see, that demographers see for the population by the end of this century, is from 4 billion to 10 billion, which is a broad range. And all these changes within India, within China, and elsewhere in Europe will, of course, lead to depopulation of many regions. And as that happens, that will set off rippling effects in the politics of those countries, and in the relationship between various countries, some of which are shrinking and some others which are not shrinking at the same rate. And that would clearly have implications also for the Hindu diaspora all over the world, because these communities will have to navigate through these rapid changes. Now, the other side to where we stand, which is of relevance to Hinduism, is that if one were to accept the proposition that Hinduism in its lived form is equivalent to yoga, because just look, we have 6 darshanas, 5 of which are analytical, and the 6th deals with how to live life, which is yoga. So if one were to accept that proposition, then we must also note that yoga is spreading all over the world. And from that perspective, Hinduism is perhaps the fastest growing religion around the world, excepting that this equation is not normally made because people look at yoga from a very narrow technical angle, and they say only those who do yoga in a particular way are Hindus, or only those who are doing yoga who claim the moniker of Hinduism for themselves are Hindus, although that's not necessarily true, because of yoga is yoga. Yoga is this union between the Jivatma or Paramatma, or the mind, the manas, and the Atman. And of course, there are many different techniques to do it, which is perfectly fine. But any effort which takes you in this direction, where, of course, we have already mentioned the fact that the Atman is not a product of the body. Atman is something transcendent. It's like a light, not ordinary light. It's a transcendent light which illuminates the contents of the mind, which is really the heart of Hinduism in one line. This is the heart of Vedanta. This is the heart of Hinduism. So if you were to look at it from this perspective, then yoga is the fastest growing tradition across the world. In fact, the latest census figures from UK, for example, had only 40-odd% claim that they were Christian. And a lot of people say that they don't have any tradition, but many of them, perhaps the majority of them, subscribe to yoga. And therefore, yoga is something which people have embraced. You go to the smallest towns in Europe or South America, as I've done, or Southeast Asia, and certainly Japan and China, people are doing yoga and they see it as fulfilling. And at the same time, people outside of the Islamic world, people are leaving traditional religion, and some of them say that they don't have any religion at all, or some of them say we are agnostic. But many of these people and others have embraced yoga as a way of self-knowledge and self-discovery, which is precisely what its purpose is in the Sanatan tradition. So I mention all this to make another point. If you look back at the tradition of Hinduism, you'll see that from time to time, the tradition has been sort of repackaged, and that has happened with the coming of the avatars, for example, or the great rishis. In each of these, each of the darshanas or the shastras, from time to time, people come along and then they repackage it. For example, if one were to talk about the Advaita Vedantic tradition from Kashmir, about 1200 years ago, it was repackaged in a way which, according to me, is exactly equivalent to Advaita Vedanta of the Vedas as Kashmir Shaivism, where the vocabulary was simplified, which is why Kashmir Shaivism caught on. Where, for example, the very first sutra of the Shiva Sutras says Chaitanyam Atma, that this Chaitanya, the awareness itself is the Atman. So Atman is not something very mysterious thing within oneself, which is what the impression one might get if one were to read older texts. but it boldly proclaims that awareness itself is the Atman, which is exactly equivalent to the Mahavakyas of the Upanishads. For example, I am Atma Brahman, that this Atman itself is Brahman, right? Or neti neti, it's not this or that. So what remains, because it's transcendent, that is what is Atman. Um, or aham brahmasmi, aham meaning myself, my experience of who I am, which is my awareness, is Brahman, is Brahma or Brahman, right? So it is exactly equivalent to what classical Vedanta says, accepting that it does in a new repackaging, which the rishis or the saints or the sages did, say, 1200 years ago. So I'm saying all this to make a deeper point, which is that that possibly the time has come that in addition to all the great texts that we have, we need to produce, with the agreement of all the living sages that we have in the Hindu tradition, new ways of communicating this information in different languages across the world. And to make this clearer, let me speak about Ayurveda, which is, of course, also a part of the Vedic tradition or the Hindu tradition. Now, Ayurveda is based on three categories. It based on wellness of the body, which is when the doshas are in harmony. So there are three doshas, there are three gunas. Now, talk where I spoke about proving that consciousness is transcendent. Likewise, there is another mathematical theorem which people in the logic community know very well, which is that analysis in two categories is not as efficient as analysis in three categories, or analysis in threes is superior to analysis in two. Now, we know that Ayurveda does analysis in threes, while allopathy, where you're only talking about the patient being well or not well, does analysis in two. And as we also know, allopathy is facing a huge crisis right now, which has been called the reproducibility crisis of medicine. And what is really happening is that 70 to 90% of all the clinical research which is published in medical journals cannot be reproduced. And the reason behind that is that due to confirmation bias, or the way these experiments are set up, maybe they're not set up as efficiently as possible, because these doctors are trying to, they're on this big rat race, they've got to get funds, et cetera, et cetera. So they come up with a finding. And then there's also this possibility that self-deception is much more common than one believes. So it may not be the case of these physicians actually trying to be deceitful, but it's very easy for a person to believe in something which, upon later scrutiny, turns out to have been wrong. And so these papers are published, and FDA sometimes certifies these results in the sense that certain drugs are approved, and later on, 2 or 3 years down the line, it's found that these drugs don't work, and there are many other side effects as well. So possibly one of the things that needs to be done is to repackage in modern terminology, as happened in the past. We have in Ayurveda, we have the Charaka Samhita, the Sushruta Samhita, and more recently, just 1,000 years ago, you have Ashtanga Hridaya. But maybe what one needs to do is to ride on top of this mathematical theorem in order to motivate those who don't know about Ayurveda, and package it in a way so that we are not only talking about what is in the Samhitas, but we are also talking about all the evolution of diseases as they are evolving and whatever is happening and all the other knowledge that we have of biology and the micro world and the viruses, etc. So that this then, in my view, would be the proper vehicle to be the medicine for the entire world. So in other words, rather than being a medical system on the fringes, as it is now, even in India, it's a medical system on the fringes. And that has happened because in India, due to our colonial experience and due to the fact that we look at our own past through the colonial lens, we had not been confident enough to say that, look, this is a medical system and let as the Chinese have done. In the Chinese, most hospitals are integrated. You go, they have the Chinese traditional medical system. So you go into the hospital and patients are sent to one or the other. So in other words, they have made the Chinese traditional system to have an equal footing with Western medicine. While in India, Ayurveda probably receives, I don't know, 3 or 4% of what Western medicine receives in India. So this is just an example of the kind of challenges that exist in the dissemination of Hinduism to the next generations. And that dissemination or that acculturation is going to be more difficult in the coming decades than what it was in the past. And that's because so long as the family system was intact, and we know that the family system is gone in the West, which is one reason why we have so much of addiction in the West. And last several years, more than 120,000 people in the US, young people, have been dying of drug overdose or fentanyl overdose. So because people are lonely and all that. Now, in the traditional family system, a lot of what young people learned were from their grandparents, from their grandmothers and grandfathers. Now, even in India, we have a unitary family system, and the children are only with their parents, and parents are busy, and so the task of education is left to the school. But sadly, in India, unlike, say, Japan or China or Korea, sadly, in India, our schools do not teach anything about the Indian knowledge tradition. Indian schooling represents Hinduism in pejorative or negative terms, which presents a colonial view of India. So Indians are growing up, or young people are growing up with not only what is totally wrong and what is prejudiced, but thinking this is the truth. And therefore, some of them who may really want to know what the truth, take this for granted. They say, well, if our school books tell this, then there must be some truth to it. And in fact, they are the greatest opponents of Hinduism. These are westernized Hindu or Western Indians or westernized Hindus who think that a lot of what Hinduism teaches is probably made up. They don't know about Hinduism's history of science, that India was the most advanced scientific nation until very recent times, until about 3 or 4 centuries ago. In fact, even the scientific revolution that took place in Europe with Newton and Leibniz, which was in the 17th century, and that revolution was based on the discovery of infinite series and calculus. In India, we already knew infinite series and calculus 3 or 4 centuries prior in Kerala, for example, in what's been accepted by scholars around the world as this outstanding Kerala School of Mathematics and Astronomy. So Indian sciences were ahead, but Indian students don't know it. Indian students don't know anything about Ayurveda, that Ayurveda also had inoculation before Europe got it. India's share of the world economy until about 1000 was close to 45%. even after 7 centuries of warfare, um, by the time the English took over in 1800, India's share of the world economy, comparative economists tell us, was about 20%, 20 to 22%. By a system of destroying India's own arts and crafts and trades, which the English did. They didn't go about beheading people as used to happen in prior centuries, or enslaving people, which happened on a very, very big scale in the prior centuries. What the British did by their system of destroying India's education, and we know India's education was quite universal, as in that famous book by Dharampal called The Beautiful Tree, by quoting English superintendents of education in the 1820s and 1830s and 40s, who fanned out across India and looked at these pathshalas which were attached to the temples, and they found that all jatis sent their children, and they estimated perhaps the literacy rate was 60, 70, or 80%. And in fact, that's not bad, given that America's functional literacy rate now, when America is the world's richest country of all time, is only in the 70s. About 20 to 25% of the US Americans cannot understand what is written in a newspaper. They can probably read their name or sign their name. So India was not doing a very bad thing as far as making people literate was concerned. Of course, the curriculum needed revisions, etc. But what the English did was they shut that system down. They shut down India's trades through a system of tariffs, and by making India the dumping ground of their factories, which came up in the 1810s and 1820s as the Industrial Revolution took off in Britain first, and then in the rest of Europe. And through this, and also by taxing India, which to such a heavy extent, for all kinds of things, not only supporting their own army, etc., in India, but also projects such as the underground in London. Historians have used the term late Victorian Holocaust, that maybe 100 million people in India died of starvation and famine. And these were famines which were created by British policies. And India's share of the world economy, which was 20 to 22% in 1800, had dropped to as low as less than 2% by the First World War. And so in addition to this, what the British did in their census, they insisted on tying up jatis to certain specific varnas, which many of these jatis in Bengal or in Northwest India or in Punjab, they said, we don't know what varna is. This is what our jati is, and we are as good as anybody else. But the census people said, no, you are this varna, and you are above and below such other jati. And those guys who fought them, who did not accept British hegemony easily, they said, well, you are criminal tribes or criminal jatis, and you will not have any jobs given to you anywhere in the country, associated with the administration. So a famous chief census guy who's British in the 1910s or 1920s said, this is a famous quote, which I've used in my own articles as well. He said, look, we decry India's caste system. And the word caste, as we know, has no synonym in any Indian language. We have jatis, and jati, as we know, is nothing but one's biological lineage, which people have all over the world. Every human being or animals also have their lineage. So the Varna category was a kind of a theoretical construct. And really, as the Bhagavad Gita says, that what one's Varna is, that's one way of looking at it, is based on one's temperament and not one's birth. The other way of looking at it is that since the Purusha Sukta, according to Purusha Sukta, the Varnas spring from the Purush, which is a personification of the Atman within each person. So every human being, no matter where they are from, which jati they are from, have the capacity to unfold whatever Varna they might want to attach to. And of course, we can talk about these Varnas, classes at the national level as a personification of a societal man, so to speak. But every human being is in the role of a teacher in their home or elsewhere, a Brahmin in the role of a protector of their family or community. They are a Kshatriya or a Rajanak. In the role of providing sustenance to their family, they are a Vaishya. And in the role of service to their own family and to the community, they are a Shudra. So it's not an issue at all. But this is, of course, being used, this whole idea of caste, which, as I said, has no synonym. It's a word from Portuguese, because Portuguese had social classification of this kind, hierarchical, and so had the Germans and the British, that the royalty and the nobles, and they did not intermarry within each other. So they projected it, and through propaganda and through the education system, which we haven't yet changed more than 70 years, or nearly 80 years after independence. And in fact, the presentations of Hinduism within the text are, as I mentioned, are negative. And by this, we are only sort of perpetuating falsehoods and making the task of keeping dharma vibrant even so much harder for ourselves. Now, thankfully, technology can be a solution to all of this. First of all, many education scholars in the West have argued that the old brick and mortar university is doomed because of its cost, and because it doesn't belong, it's not in consonance with the technology of our time. Why pay $100,000 for a year of schooling in a college where you're teaching, where you're doing various, let's say, arts or liberal arts or social sciences, or these courses where these stories are also freely available, where in each of these, what you're given are stories, and these stories are freely available. So educators are quite convinced that a lot of the universities will go under. And that's why in many Western countries, like Canada, they are getting hundreds of thousands of students every year in order to prop up their universities. And many of these students are from India. And they are taking huge loans in the hope that finally they'll find jobs, and those jobs have sort of disappeared in Canada. So when these pipelines dry up, and when these pipelines dry up in the US itself, when parents say, what's the point? And when even companies would say, well, why hire somebody with a college education where we can train a student to have programming and other AI skills with our internal programs, as many Bay Area universities have already begun, Bay Area companies have already begun to do. Clearly, that will lead to havoc and bloodbath in the whole framework of brick and mortar university. And that's where is a way out for us. And maybe that's where VaYU comes in. We need to create a delivery system so that all this amazing, extraordinary knowledge that we have in our tradition, which is perfectly consistent with science, which has actually given birth to science as we know. As we know, the creators of quantum mechanics were Vedantins, like Erwin Schrödinger was, and he claims that he got his central idea from Vedanta. And as we know, quantum mechanics is the basis of chemistry, and which in turn is the basis of biology, etc. So all of Vedic tradition is consistent with science, and it also goes beyond traditional science, because it's talking about this issue of consciousness, of Atman, which is the frontier of science, frontier of psychology, frontier of computer science, frontier of physics, and frontier of self-knowledge, which in a world where populations collapse, where people feel totally rudderless because there are no families, as populations decline very rapidly, as is happening, for example, in Ukraine. Ukraine's population 20 years ago was 56 million. Now it's down to about 30 million. Or if you look at the US in 2060 will be only about 40% white and nearly 30% Hispanic. And so things will change. And most families right now in Europe, um, China, Japan, and white people, as well as Indian people in the Americas, are having only, on an average, one, slightly over than one child, 1.2 children. So there are not that many children to play with. We don't hear children screaming in airplanes. Unlike when I was young, we used to take any bus from Jammu to Srinagar or Srinagar to Jammu. There used to be so many children with their mothers, right? That's all gone. We are in a totally unprecedented, extraordinary place, which, in my view, creates the greatest opportunity for this um, extraordinary knowledge, which is the Sanatan tradition, which is a tradition not just for us from Bharat, but for people from all over the world. And some people have already started to appreciate it in the most unlikely places. I know for a fact, I've heard it being told to me by somebody who's to be trusted, that Saudi Arabia has already introduced yoga. We acknowledge it's only asanas at this time, in schools and colleges. And I even heard somewhere that they are even introducing elements of the Bhagavad Gita, and they are also introducing their own prior religion, with their three goddesses, which are like the three great goddesses of the Sanatan tradition, their own three goddesses. So things are changing at the most unlikely of places. I think where we are in a bad spot, or perhaps South Asia. But within India, we have to have the courage to introduce this curriculum. We have to have the Atma Vishwas to introduce a curriculum. And this is not a sectarian curriculum. The Vedic, the Sanatan curriculum is a universal curriculum. We have to stand up and proclaim that with confidence. And once we do that, people will listen. And perhaps the fact that we haven't quite done that may be one of the reasons that the BJP did not do as well as it expected to in the recent elections. I think the time has come. We're not doing it out of putting any other group down. The Vedic tradition is beautiful. It's amazing. It's life-changing. It gives you, as the Yoga Sutra says, it gives you siddhis, it gives you amazing abilities, because they all already exist within you. It's only that we're not aware. We are living in the domain of ideas or stories of the manas. We are putting our face away from the Atman within us. So if we only turn that, we will discover, as with Shankaracharya, Shivoham. And that will be a change of the world. And there, I'm quite sure that VaYU can play a very significant role through its efforts, and also becoming a template for similar efforts all across the world. With this, thank you very much, and namaskar.